Well, hello and welcome to Idol Killer, a ministry dedicated to destroying sacred cows for the cause of Christ. I'm your host, Warren McGrew, and joining us once again is Dr. Alan Rhoda. Dr. Rhoda, thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Always love our conversations.
Well, I enjoy it as well. I am not a PhD. I'm a lay philosopher, so I reserve the right to disagree with you and be wrong. But I always enjoy our conversations on the program, and the reason for our viewers for bringing Dr. Rhoda on, we had a conversation on 4 different views of divine providence and the problem of evil, which was very fascinating. But then I took a clip of Dr. Rhoda from an interview that you had on another program, and I included it in a video response to Anthony Rogers, who made a claim that open theism is a form of heresy. And so I wanted to respond to this claim that open theism is a heretical form of atheism, and I wanted to give a kind of a brief overview of open theism and just kind of show that there were some problems with his arguments and his reasoning, and that his claim was fallacious. And we're going to get to this here in just a minute. But we had a viewer of the program who was watching, and he has a friend, and he sent him a video because his friend is pretty critical of open theism. And he said, "Hey, I like this video that Idol Killer put out, and Dr. Rhoda and Greg Boyd and several other William Hasker was included in there.
Yeah,
had Ryan Mullins, who's not an open theist. He's I believe a self-described Molinist. But he's like, I really dug this video. Take a watch and tell me what you think." And this gentleman had a few criticisms of that position, and I thought, well, it'd be fun to bring Dr. Rhoda on and kind of review this together in a lighthearted, friendly, not super critical, no mean spirit, just kind of like go over the article and kind of respond to it. And he actually referenced some of the statements that you had made in the video. So I thought, well, who better to respond to that than the man who I took out of context and put my video response. So if you're ready, I'll go ahead and I'll pull this up, and we can kind of go over this together and just see what you think of the criticism. And fair warning, he does get some things right here. So for example, he says, fair warning, the video is difficult to watch. So he got that right off the bat. And he said it's an amateurish conglomeration of clips, text, and sound with very little consistency. And I don't think I've ever had a more accurate review of my program. So he does get quite a bit correct here. But the gentleman who wrote this article is Bill Fortenberry. And you'll see here it says on his website that he's a Christian philosopher and historian. And I did a little bit of digging, trying to find more information about Mr. Fortenberry, and I believe he's self-published a couple books on, I believe it was the American Revolution, but I wasn't able to find out a whole lot about him. But you can see here, if you're interested, I'll put the link to this article in the video below, and you can see how he styles himself here. He talks about his appearances on various shows and how he's written for legal journals and whatnot. But, Dr. Rhoda, are you ready to begin?
Yep, let's get to it.
All right. So here he's kind of just outlining how he came to be familiar with the video. As I said, a friend of his sent it to him and requested that he watch and respond to it. But you'll see right here, he begins with this assertion: open theism is the belief that God does not know everything that will actually happen in the future. On this view, God knows every possible future, but he does not know which of those possibilities will eventually be a reality. And I believe you had something you wanted to address about that kind of summation of the open position.
Yeah, it's important whenever you're describing a position, especially a position that you intend to critique, that you make a concerted effort to state the position in a way that its proponents would recognize as fair before you jump into your criticisms, and that's not always easy to do, especially if, you're coming from a different perspective, to try to get your head into the mindset of the people you're critiquing. It requires a bit of a gestalt shift, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the interests of just clearing things up, okay, so he says open theism is the belief that God does not know everything that will actually happen in the future. I would say no. Well, there are some open theists who you could pin that on, but the majority of open theists, especially nowadays, hold to the view that God's omniscience is completely unqualified. God knows absolutely everything there is to know because God is fully acquainted with all of reality. So if there are things that will actually happen in the future, well, then God knows those, right? That's part of open theism. Where the open theist is going to differ from, I guess, the non-open theist, if you will, is the non-open theist thinks that the class of, or the category of what will actually happen in the future includes a complete determinate or like a unique and complete extension of the past and present. So there's one specific way of it, out of all the possible futures, there's one particular future starting now and going all the way to kingdom come and beyond, that is the actual future. Okay, that's what the non-open theists believes. Whereas the open theist thinks that, well, sure, there are things that will actually happen in the future, like Christ is going to come again, and there's going to be a final judgment, and things like this. The sun will come up tomorrow, and whatnot. Lots of things that are already set, either by God's design. There's lots of stuff that's already set, but open futurists, or excuse me, open theists, don't believe that there is that the future is entirely set, in the sense that out of all of the possibilities, there is no one complete extension of history that is the unique actual future. There are still multiple futures or ways the course of history could go. There are choice points at which we could go this way or we could go that way, and there simply is no fact of the matter yet about how that's going to play out. So there's some events which are going to occur on every like possible extension of history, like no matter what the choices we make, eventually we know that Jesus is going to return and there's going to be a final judgment, right? How exactly we get there, well, to some extent that remains to be seen. But certain things are going to happen, regardless of what choices we make here and now. Okay, so the first point, open theists do believe that God knows everything that will actually happen in the future. The second sentence, he says, God knows every possible future. Good. But then he says he does not know which of those possibilities will eventually be a reality. That's true, except it's misleadingly stated because the way it's put there, it kind of insinuates that there is a fact of the matter as to which of those possibilities will eventually be a reality.
Because I think you and I would agree that if there is a fact of the matter, that let's say I have an opportunity to eat fish or steak for dinner, but the fact of the matter is, because God knows my heart character, He knows I hate seafood.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if you put it on the menu. He knows I'm not going to choose it.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's a possibility, that would still have a fact of the matter, and thus God would know it.
Mm-hmm.
And so God can know, even though there's possibilities, there is a specific way I'll respond in that scenario. But there's still also some possibilities there is no such fact of the matter. And so I think this loses some nuance there, and really fails to capture the open position, like one like I hold, which is dynamic omniscience, because God knows. Okay, Warren doesn't like seafood. He knows my character. He knows my heart. He grounds his knowledge in my intentions and character, and so there could be a fact of the matter about which possibility will be, and so thus God knows it. But if it's truly indeterminate, then He doesn't know it. He knows it as indeterminate.
Yeah, exactly. If God is unqualifiedly omniscient, then He knows all of reality. But if, as open theists would argue, if reality is genuinely open-ended, then it follows from omniscience that God knows reality as open-ended.
Mm.
So,
And so,
anyway.
Do you feel like we've pretty much responded? Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, or do you think we've pretty much nailed it?
I think we can move on.
Okay. So he does say that this view is fraught with errors, but for his post, he's going to limit himself to offering a rough and unfiltered commentary in response to the claims made in the video. Now, one of the things that's important is to know the context of the video, which again was responding to the claim that open theism is a form of atheism. It wasn't intended to give an exhaustive articulation and philosophical and biblical robust defense. It's just going, hey, that's a silly claim. It doesn't take a whole lot to refute the claim that open theism is atheism. But I think some of his article here kind of it fails to recognize the context of that video, and that the claims made in this video are very specific to claims made by Anthony Rogers. And so I think we need to make sure that we put that disclaimer out there. This is not a robust biblical and philosophical defense of open theism.
Yeah. One thing that might have perhaps misled Bill in that regard, if you scroll up just a bit to the top of that thing where it says the video, you see like the title, the question there, it says, what is open theism? What does it mean?
Yeah.
If you focus on that, you might say that the point of the video is primarily to articulate open theism.
And that's a fair point. When you're dealing with YouTube, there's a sweet science between the thumbnail and the video description and the title.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still learning all of that. So perhaps in my effort to capitalize on the algorithm, Bill might have been misled unintentionally to think that this was a robust defense, but that really wasn't my intent. But I appreciate you pointing that out, Alan. I think we want to be fair to him. But again, like I said, he did get this right. So if anything, he is a very astute critic here. He also says that he's writing a response to the book "The God Who Risks" by John Sanders. I believe at the time of this recording, he's posted part one of I don't know how many. I don't think we're really going to touch on that today. We're just going to focus on this article. and it seems like there may be a tendency to assume of the open position a particular flavor and treat it as monolithic, or a particular application of an open view to a passage or a philosophical issue, and say that that is the definitive open position on those things. I've had Dr. John Sanders on, and we talked about the open position and dynamic omniscience, and we agreed on some things and disagreed on some others. Mm-hmm. So if somebody was coming in and saying, well, all we know about open theism is what John Sanders has said, I'm sure there's areas where you're going to find some disagreement with Dr. Sanders, and that's kind of, it's not unique to the open position. I mean, find me 5 Calvinists who all agree on the Lapsarian controversy, and I'll bake them a cake. It's pretty rare.
Yeah, I prefer to think of open theism as a sort of a, in terms of the, in terms of commitment to 3 or 4 main theses, and that's it. So as long as you endorse those theses, I count you as an open theist, even if you disagree with me on nearly everything else, So, so I don't think one has to even be a Christian to be an open theist.
No, and Sanders has written an article showing that the open position has been historical and across various faiths throughout history. So I would agree with that.
It's not meant to be a full-on like systematic philosophy and theology that says something about all the subjects which might be of interest to us. It's simply a thesis about it's simply a very broad view about God and at least in general terms how God relates to creation. All the specifics, you can find open theists who are going to disagree about almost all all the other issues that one might address. But
right. So he does give us timestamps, which is very helpful here. But I'll go ahead and I'll just perhaps link the video, and we'll just skip those timestamps here. We'll just respond to his statements here for the sake of time. Mm-hmm. But at the 1:30-minute mark, he says, open theism is not the only theological view which claims possibilities are real. Therefore, defining open theism as merely the recognition that possibilities are real is a false claim. Many people accept the reality of possibilities while simultaneously rejecting other core tenets of open theism. So, Dr. Rhoda, let me ask you this.
Well, that's true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go very far, because nobody denies that possibilities are real. So what's he responding to here? I think there were some parts in your video that I think were a little bit misleading, and that may have triggered him in terms of what he's saying here. So at around half a minute into your video, there's a slide that contrasts atheism and open theism. And it describes open theism as the view that God exists and knows reality includes possibilities. Okay, but that's not a very good characterization of open theism, because every version of theism is going to endorse that, right? God exists and God knows possibilities. Even the Calvinists are going to say that, right? God knows all the possible worlds he could have ordained, right? So So that wasn't, a particularly good sort of characterization of open theism, and I think Bill is reacting in part to that.
So then I think it's fair to say that I've demonstrated a pretty thick skin, as I'm being criticized by both Dr. Rhoda and Mr. Fortenberry. So, gosh, I brought you on. You're supposed to be my corner man, Alan, and here you are, pointing out my lack of nuance. See, I'm a contractor by trade, and so often I bring a hammer to these situations instead of a scalpel. So I like to subject myself. I'm a weird individual. I like to subject myself to criticism so that I can continually improve, or help others when they need to bring a hammer. So the reason I noted that God exists and knows reality, includes possibilities, was I was summarizing Greg Boyd's statement there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're in a theistic determinist camp, where in an eternity past, in let's say a logical moment, God decreed everything that will transpire. At this point in time, temporally speaking, the only thing that will manifest is what God has determined will manifest. So there's really no genuine possibility of an alternative occurring, though. Wouldn't you say that would be correct, or am I missing something here?
Yeah, as long as we're clear about what sorts of possibilities we're talking about, right?
Okay.
We're not talking about mere logical possibilities, right? Even a theistic determinist is going to say, well, there are other logical possibilities, and they may even say there are other metaphysical possibilities. But the sense in which the open theist wants to say possibilities are real, and say the Calvinist is going to deny that, is going to have to do with more specifically with causal possibility, that in virtue of how reality is configured, the laws of nature, the what types of beings exist, and the powers that these beings have, the Calvinist is going to say there is only one way reality can go. It's determined, causally determined. So there are causal possibilities, but there's only one of them, right? Whereas the open theist is going to say, or anyone who holds to like a free will form of theism, the Arminian,
because even simple foreknowledge will say,
yeah,
what we're affirming, but they don't try to clarify and quantify and explain it. It's more of from my perspective, simple foreknowledge seems to be more of an appeal to mystery as to how that works out.
yeah. But we all agree that there are multiple causal possibilities, right? And so that's the sort of possibility that's relevant here. Now the open theist is going to go on and say, if there are multiple causal possibilities, if the future is causally open, then it cannot also be epistemically settled. In other words, if there are multiple ways reality could really go from here on out, the choice points, where it's go this way or that way, then there simply is there is not yet any fact of the matter that specifies which choice is going to be made. Right? That fact doesn't exist until the choice happens. And so, and if there is no such fact, then there's nothing there for an omniscient being to know about that.
Right.
Right? The reality is causally open-ended, and God, being omniscient, knows it as such.
Okay. Now, so we've gotten the criticism. You guys have ganged up on me a little bit here. It's okay. I'm going to survive. And then around the 2-minute mark, he says the claim that classical theism is derived from Greek philosophers is both fallacious and false. And what's interesting is that there's another video.
There's no doubt that the tradition was influenced by pagan philosophy, in particular Neoplatonism.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not Warren McGrew, the crude, unrefined gentleman that he is, making this claim. I'm going to pin that on smarter men than myself, but I have studied the matter, and it does seem to be rather indisputable that classical theism is largely predicated upon Neoplatonist concepts that were derived from Plotinus and whatnot. Do you have a response to this?
Well, yeah. So he's claiming that this claim that classical theism derives from Greek philosophy is fallacious and false, and he goes on to elaborate what he means by that. He says it's fallacious because it commits a genetic fallacy, and it's false because there's a lot of diversity among the Greek philosophers. They didn't particularly agree on a whole lot, and open theism, he says, is just a modern attempt to bring back this Aristotelian dichotomy of potency and actuality. And so it seems to me that if you look at the various claims he's making here, that it's really his comment that is both fallacious and false. First of all, the charge that there's a genetic fallacy here is fallacious because this is a straw man. There is no genetic fallacy in the claim that classical theism derives from Greek philosophy, unless one goes on to say, well, anything that derives from Greek philosophy is just bad and we got to throw it out. That would be a genetic fallacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You reject something simply because of where it comes from, right? But there was no claim of that sort in your video, right?
No.
Nobody was trying to just give this blanket rejection of Greek philosophy. There's also, I think you can say it's also fallacious because there's a bit of a non sequitur in Bill's comment here. The mere fact that Greek philosophers that they disagreed with each other, like if you contrast, say, for example, Heraclitus, who thought that everything is in flux, with someone such as Parmenides, who thought that nothing ever changes. Well, okay, you've got a pretty clear contrast there. They're both Greek philosophers, but but the mere fact that Greek philosophers that they disagreed with each other about a lot doesn't undermine the claim that classical theism has roots in Greek philosophy. That's kind of neither here nor there. Also, his claim, I would say, is his claim about the end, about Aristotle's act potency distinction, and that open theism is just a modern rebranding of this, is completely false. There is, so far as I can see, there is zero real connection between Aristotelian act potency and open theism. To see this, just think of in the Middle Ages, the main sorts of thinkers who really dove into Aristotelian philosophy and developed it in a theological way. You have people like Aquinas among the Christian scholars as kind of the pinnacle of the synthesis of Aristotelian thought with Christianity. In the Muslim world, you have Avicenna was kind of the, and Averroes and folks like them. In the Jewish community, you had Maimonides. All of these people developed their theologies with explicit reference to Aristotle's metaphysics and act potency stuff, and they're all classical theists. None of them is even remotely an open theist. So this shows, I think, that open theism isn't, you can affirm all of the act potency stuff you want. That alone does not get you anywhere in the neighborhood of open theism. So it's quite a mystery to me why Bill thinks that this is a fair way to characterize open theism. It's not a derivation from at least that facet of Greek philosophy. You can point to, say, at least one small part of Aristotle's philosophy in a writing of his called the De Interpretatione, or On Interpretation, chapter 9, where he talks about this problem of future contingency. And at least on the dominant interpretation, Aristotle is thought to have advocated for the view that future contingent propositions, like there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or there will not be a sea battle tomorrow, that these are neither true nor false. And you might argue that open theism is in some sense indebted to that, though not very clearly, because there's a lot of intermediate developments, and you can be an open theist while disagreeing with Aristotle about the neither true nor false claim. You could think all future contingents are simply false.
Yeah.
That's my view. But
I take the neither or, and you take the false.
Yeah.
And like I said, I reserve the right to be wrong.
Yeah. So that's the only place where I can see any way you could try to tie open theism to Aristotle in some indirect way. Aristotle himself obviously wasn't even a traditional theist. He had a view of God as that described in his metaphysics as thought thinking itself, which sounds like a pretty self-absorbed sort of deity. But I think it could plausibly be argued that classical theism does lead to that sort of God, a God who is completely indifferent to creation. But that's another argument, and we don't have to go there right now.
Well, at the 2:15 mark, he says that what Greg Boyd presents as the classical view was actually just the Calvinism-Arminian version of determinism, which would be more properly called a classical view instead of the classical view. And he says that Boyd is ignoring more than 1,500 years of theological writings by framing these two branches of determinism as the classical view. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I didn't really understand this. He says the Calvinism/Arminianism version of determinism. Is he saying that Arminianism is deterministic? I don't know of any Arminian who would agree with that. Most Arminians form something like a simple foreknowledge view. Some of them are Molinists, but none of them are determinists, to my knowledge. So in the clip by Boyd, I think what he was was trying to describe the, what he calls the open view of the future. That God knows the future not as an as something that's exhaustively settled, but as something that that partly consists of open-ended possibilities, right? And that's what Boyd called the class, and uh,
The Arminian.
so what Boyd in that clip called the classical view was the classical view of God's foreknowledge, not determinism. He wasn't affirming any, like trying to tie the classical view to any version of determinism, but simply to the view that God knows the future as an exhaustively settled reality, that God has, the term Boyd likes to use for that is to say that God has exhaustively definite foreknowledge, that there is a definite, way the future is going to go, and all those details are already kind of set in some way. They're all, there's a complete true story of the future, and God knows that. But you don't have to even be a determinist to affirm that. And anyone, all your classical Arminians and your Molinists, simple foreknowledge people, are going to hold to that sort of thing, even if they don't affirm Calvinistic determinism. So when he's that Calvinism and Arminianism are derived from a common deterministic answer, I'm like, what? What the heck?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he's alluding to Augustine there, and they're both developments in sort of a Western theology that is not entirely, but to a significant extent, a development of Augustinianism. At least Western theology owes a whole lot to Augustine.
Right.
But yeah, I'm just not sure why he thinks Arminianism is a branch of determinism.
And then he goes on to say that the unresolved possibilities that Greg Boyd speaks of are nothing more than that Aristotelian concept of potentiality, and that open theism is just a modern rebranding of this Greek concept, which I think you've successfully addressed just a moment ago.
Yeah, I could probably say just a little bit more about that. If you say that open theism is just a modern rebranding of this, then that seems to imply that that open theism just kind of that if you invoke this distinction of act and potency, that you're
poof, you're an open theist.
that it just like falls out of that distinction. I want to say absolutely not. In fact, I would argue, and I think if you look at any textbooks on scholastic metaphysics, you'll see this in spades. Go look at the recent book on scholastic metaphysics by Edward Feser. He's a Thomist, and I found online. I found this this chart that a person tried to make, drawing all of the subtle distinctions between these different kinds of act and kinds of potency, and there's so many distinctions. So you don't just have act and potency, you have real potency and active potency and passive potency and uncreative active potency and creative active potency and pure act and mixed act and operative act and entitative act and essential act and existential act, and it goes on and on. You don't have just one act potency distinction. There's many such distinctions, and in a blog post of my own that I wrote a year or so ago, I tried to sort some of this stuff out for myself, and it seemed to me that there's at least 4 different ways that Aquinas is using the act potency distinction, and it's not at all obvious that you can that that these all stand or fall together, you know. So, for example, the most obvious case where I think act potency makes the most sense is when you're thinking about intrinsic change. You know, in his first way argument, he uses the example of a log that is brought near fire. You know, the fire is actually hot and causes the log, which is potentially hot, to become actually hot, right? So it brings about a change in the log, right? And that's one way to apply the act potency distinction. But it's not the, you know, but he applies it in a bunch of different ways. For example, he applies it in trying to understand the multiplicity with respect to a universal. You know, so for example, there are many human beings. We all are instances of the same form, if you will. Well, how is it that we can all be unique individuals? And Aquinas's answer is matter. So he thinks of the form as the act and the matter as the potency, right? So that's another way of applying that act potency distinction that really has nothing to do with the application of the fire in the log, you know, where you're dealing with intrinsic change. Here we're dealing with a static type of metaphysical composition, right? He also applies it in the case of, in the case of essence and existence. You know, the existence is the act, the essence is the potency. So when one talks about the act potency distinction, it's kind of like, which one?
Yeah.
What application of this distinction? You have this act potency language used in a whole bunch of different ways, but there is no such thing as the act potency distinction. There's many distinctions.
It's a good point. I think I can't be too hard on him because I also have lacked nuance. But I think when we do, we need to point that out, and we need to say, look, you're not being clear, you're not being accurate. But Dr. Rhoda, you're far more clear and accurate and to the point than I am. So yeah. I'll let you bring that up.
Where I would chide Bill on this a bit is he makes clear at one point that open or he like presents it like open theists just don't know their history.
Yeah.
And their view is just a rebranding of this and of this concept, and that's a historically ignorant claim on his part by somebody who styles himself a historian and philosopher. So it's
here it is. I just pulled this up so we can address this. This is a little bit further on down in the article, but he says, by the way, future contingency is another concept that is drawn from Aristotelian philosophy. That fact doesn't really bother me at all, but I find it ironic that open theists are so quick to criticize their opponents for using concepts derived from Greek philosophers when they do the exact same thing themselves. I suspect that most open theists are simply not knowledgeable enough of the history of their own philosophy to realize their accusations are hypocritical.
Yeah. We'll come back to that more later on, but yeah, there's when he presents himself as knowing this stuff in a better way than open theistic scholars, the ones who were presented in your video, do. That strikes me as just quite uncharitable and not well informed.
And I would agree with that sentiment. And then when we get to the 540 mark, he makes a note that and then here he starts picking on you. So I can take a breather. He says, it was interesting to hear that you added the qualifier causally to the claim that the future is open. He says, this is an important clarification because it reveals the common foundation that supports both Calvinism and open theism. both systems view God's knowledge of the future events as causative. Now, I think what he's doing is he's conflating the way that we see grounding of future contingents and knowledge of those with determinism. And I think he's conflating those two, but perhaps you could elucidate on that a little bit more from your own perspective.
Yeah, okay. So he makes this claim that both systems, open theism and Calvinism, view God's knowledge of the future as causative, and then he tries to illustrate that with these syllogisms that he presents below. First of all, before looking at those syllogisms, I'm going to say that neither system says God's knowledge of the future is causative. I don't know of anybody who thinks that. The Calvinist doesn't think that God's knowledge causes things. They'll say that God himself causes things, and that's why he knows it.
Yeah, it's the effectual eternal decree that is causal and the grounding of his own knowledge.
Yeah, the knowledge is a consequence of his own causal activity.
Right.
But it's not itself the cause. It's it's a consequence of the cause. So I'd be interested if Bill could cite anyone who clearly says God's knowledge itself is causal. Who might that be? It's certainly not going to be the open theist. And I don't think any informed Calvinist would say that either. There are, well, let me say, there are things that, like Aquinas says in places, that, you know, God knows creation as the cause of creation, right? But again, it's not the knowledge itself that's doing the causing, right? It's the causal activity of God that brings about the creation in the first place, and brings about God's having the knowledge that he does. Right?
And I've heard criticisms, and I've levied a few, of the position that would say that if God has never had a logical or temporal moment wherein he freely decided and determined what he would do, and then that knowledge would be causal, in that he would be a creature of fate himself, or of a nature that he could not change. But that would be rejecting a temporal or a logical moment wherein he issued the causal decree. So if you get rid of him freely decreeing in a moment in his life, whether temporal or logical, then we could say that his knowledge is causal, because it would cause and dictate even his own future actions. But as I pointed out in the video with Ryan Mullins, the classic Calvinist position, which we alluded to earlier with the Lapsarian controversy, they affirmed that there was a moment in the life of God, logically, where the future was indeterminate, and he issued this decree, thus grounding his knowledge of future contingents. So this is one of those things where it's like, when I'm pointing this out in the video, critiquing Roger's position, and I'm saying you're out of step with the historic Calvinist position of logical moments, because he's trying to avoid this undercutting defeater, because he wants to condemn open positions as heretical. So he's trying to get rid of his own foundational open premise of God decreeing, and prior to that having an open perspective. Then you get into a situation where knowledge is causal, but that's not the open position. That's a critique of abandoning even the classical Calvinist view.
Yeah, I'm not sure that even in that case it'd be right to say knowledge is causal. If you deny divine freedom, right? You say God just sort of necessarily creates the exact world that he creates, right? There's, you could see this as maybe a version of this idea is entailed by Leibniz's view that trying to think of the phrasing, um, that God creates the best of all possible worlds.
Mm-hmm.
If you think there is such a thing as a uniquely best possible world, and that God, because of his goodness, say, is sort of constrained by his own nature to actualize that world and no other world, right? Then you could say, well, God has no freedom in the matter. It's just, but it's not really, again, the knowledge that's causing things. It's kind of the divine nature.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think there, and perhaps I'm committing a misstep due to conflating divine simplicity with some of these decrees and getting into that modal collapse.
Well, yeah, divine simplicity makes
Yeah, it's a
mess
fun
of
one.
things. What a proponent of divine simplicity has to do, because what they, well, let me present it in this way. If you think, if you accept the sort of classical view of divine simplicity that you find in Augustine and Aquinas, that God is whatever he has, or that God just is ipsum esse subsistens, he is being itself subsisting, and he is identical to his essence, and he is all of his essential properties are identical to him and to each other. Then what that kind of forces you to say that, well, God would be intrinsically exactly as he is, no matter what, right? So no matter what possible world were actual, wouldn't make a difference to God, right? God is intrinsically identical under all circumstances. Well, how then can you make sense of contingency? The contingency of creation. Well, you either run into a modal collapse, right? Because if you say that God is necessarily the same under all circumstances, and the information about this, the history of creation, is intrinsic to God, well, then that information about creation is going to be just as necessary as God's own essence. And so all of creation has to be metaphysically necessary, right? There is no possibility of a different creation, of anything being different than it is. So you get a modal collapse. Everything's necessary. The only way out of that, if you're a classical theist who affirms this kind of divine simplicity, is you're going to have to say that information about creation or about anything contingent is extrinsic to God. But then you've got to try to tell a story about, well, if the information's extrinsic to God, not intrinsic, then how is it that God even knows it?
Yeah.
It seems like you're saying that God is not even providential, because he doesn't even will this creation, because that would seem to bring it into God. God's will is modified.
It's identical, yeah, because we get to that.
Or that God's knowledge is modified in a specific way to represent this content and not that content. But you can't say that, right? So you have to tell a story using an idea called content externalism, and try to say how God can be omniscient even though all the content of his knowledge and will is extrinsic to him. I don't think that has any plausibility, but that's the only way to avoid the modal collapse while continuing to affirm a strong view of divine simplicity. It's not an attractive package, I think, but there it is, because it winds up having the implication, I think, that God is intrinsically indifferent to creation. If you think about that,
Well, then you get into a strong view of immutability and atemporality, where you don't even have Cambridge changes, and
yeah,
God did not become creator and Lord or redeemer and savior. And when you start tinkering around with classical theism and look under the hood, there's some interesting things that you find in there that
yeah,
you go, oh well, let's just take this out. This will fix it, and it doesn't. It causes some other issues.
it's a tight package, and if you yank out immutability, or you yank out impassibility, or you yank out timelessness or simplicity, everything else just drops aside. Like, or well, there might be some ways to salvage at least some certain kind of impassibility, or a certain kind of immutability, or a qualified type of simplicity, but you can't have the full strong versions of those attributes that the classical theists have typically wanted to endorse. So you pull it at one thread, and a whole lot more unravels. So
that's it. I mean, it's a fascinating study that you don't just dedicate a week to. There's so much there. But he goes on here, and he says the similarity and differences between the two views can be seen when they are put into two syllogisms. He says the Calvinist view believes that, one, God can only know the future events if he also causes them, which seems to deal with his previous assertion. But then, two, God knows all future events. Three, therefore, God causes all future events. And then he goes on to claim that the open theist believes that, one, God can only know future events if he also causes them. So we see a correlation between these two views. Two, God does not cause all future events. Three, therefore, God does not know all future events.
Yeah.
But I think I would hold that God knows those inevitable, fixed, certain future events, which he is not causing, because he knows it by grounding it in the very nature of reality, the condition of our hearts and intentions and minds, and all the variable factors. We've got David and Keilah and Saul, and God knew this future event because that's where it was headed. And so here we see God even knowing a future contingent event that never occurred. But do you want to speak more to this compared syllogism here?
Yeah, I think the Calvinist syllogism is broadly correct, though we might want to insert the word if he ultimately causes them, because Calvinists are going to want to insist on a distinction between primary and secondary causation. And they're not going to want to, just say that God can only know future events if he directly, or, if he causes them in a primary way, right? That would lead to occasionalism, and few people want to be that radical. As far as the open theist syllogism here, I would just simply reject the first premise. Yeah, God can do what the Calvinists think God does. In other words, he can decide, hey, I want certain events to happen, and I'm going to set up the causal framework to ensure that they do happen, either by bringing it about myself in a primary causal way, or by designing laws of nature and initial conditions, and just to where it's causal inevitability. But God doesn't have to do that, and the open theist is going to say, to some extent, God doesn't do that. So how else could God know future events if he doesn't cause them, directly or indirectly? Well, here's how. God can wait and see. And to some extent, that's what the open theists think God has chosen to do. He has left some decisions up to his creatures, to decide. He's chosen not to cause them, directly or indirectly. He's chosen to leave them as possibilities for his creatures to decide upon.
Now, if I could interject here, some of our viewers might find that to be rather shocking, especially if they come from this Calvinist background.
Uh-huh.
But if you look at Genesis, where God brings the animals to Adam to see what he'll name them, we don't think that that somehow robbed God of his sovereignty, and yet he wasn't causing primary or secondary Adam to name an elephant and a kangaroo. And if I bought my child a teddy bear and I brought it home, I could name it, Fluffy, or I could give it to my child and let her name it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't deny me of my role of the sovereign of the house, or as her father, to let this child name a teddy bear.
Yeah.
So to relegate some degree of autonomy and self-determination to another agent doesn't negate God as being God, but you often will see that charge being made. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. There is strong biblical evidence for God bestowing that sort of determination upon his image bearers and doing, as you said, waiting and seeing. And it doesn't throw the entire universe off kilter because there's some rogue molecule like R.C. Sproul has asserted.
Mm-hmm.
Adam naming an aardvark didn't throw the earth off its orbit and into the sun.
Yeah.
God is still God and in control.
Yeah.
He doesn't control all things in that causal way.
Yeah, we also think, God knows the probabilities. God knows how the world is trending or tending at any given point. Even if it's not determined, causally determined, there's some things are much more likely than others. And God knows what those probabilities are. And, there's nothing that's gonna just kind of, because God is omniscient, he knows all possibilities. He can anticipate and do contingency planning for every possible scenario. And all these scenarios are only possible to the extent that God allows them to be possible. So, he's the one who sovereignly decides what the scope for creaturely possibility is. So there's no chance that creation is going to just go off the rails from God's perspective. To the extent that, say, worst case scenario happens, it's a risk that God has sovereignly chosen to take, and has chosen presumably for very good reasons. So.
Yeah.
Anyway,
well said. I agree entirely. But he goes on and he says, both views share this identical first premise. Defenders of both of these views often see that the first premise is an infallible truth. But wait a minute, didn't you just absolutely unequivocally just toss this out?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to add to this section before I go on to the next?
Can God, okay. So he says neither view provides evidence for accepting the first premise as true. Again, the open theist isn't going to accept the first premise. And he says, can God know a future event without his knowledge causing that event to be settled into action? Well, yeah, because nobody thinks his knowledge causes the events. God's power, God himself can cause an event to happen. That doesn't mean his knowledge causes it, right? Both camps would answer that in the negative. No, both camps would say that knowledge isn't directly causal.
I can look at a car speeding towards a cliff, know that it's reached the point of no return, and that it's going to careen and go over the edge just by observing it. I have this knowledge in advance of this car going over the edge, but that knowledge in and of itself didn't cause it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got information, derived from your own experience about the laws of nature, how things work, and you can see the car's got a certain momentum, and these things don't stop on a dime.
Right.
And you can say, absent some kind of miraculous intervention, we can be pretty darn sure how it's going to play out, right?
Right.
But yeah. All right. Next, I guess part he's commenting on the part where you had a clip of me and I was talking over a slide from a video where I was presenting a philosophical case for open theism.
Mm-hmm.
And at that particular point, I was just articulating open theism. I was trying to lay out, these are the core claims.
Which is why I included that clip in this video response, just giving a brief summary, not an in-depth. And that was really the reason for including that.
Yeah. So let me see. So he says, Rhoda makes this claim that an epistemically settled future cannot also be causally open. Yeah, so that's a claim that open theists are going to make, right? I did not attempt in that clip or that present part to justify the claim, right? That my strategy is first to describe what open theists believe and then to give some arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't provide that part of it because that would have extended your video quite a bit more. But anyway, but then he says this seems to be just a tautology. A tautology, for those who don't know the word, is a claim that's trivially true. It's like,
water is wet.
Yeah, or well, that's not strictly a tautology. But say water is water.
Oh, yeah.
Or Mr. Ed, a horse is a horse.
Mm-hmm.
Well, duh. I mean, of course, right? What else? I mean, how could it be otherwise? Or what will be. The que sera, sera. That's a tautology because it's semantically vacuous, right? You don't even have to know what a horse is, or what if I say a horse is a horse, just replace that with some gibberish term, and make it the same thing in both cases, and it's equally true, and you have no idea what it means. It tells you nothing about what what is a horse. At least water is wet tells you something about water.
Yeah,
it's not completely vacuous. So
even when I try, guys, to be vacuous, I fail. I am too deep and too wise to even attempt to be successfully vacuous.
Yeah,
I gotta work harder on that, Dr. Rhoda.
So when he claims that my statement that an epistemically settled future cannot also be causally open, when he wants to suggest this is just a tautology, then it's, well, as he goes on to say in the next sentence, is when open theists use the term settled, they seem to be referring to Calvinist determinism, okay, which the determinism means the future is causally settled, right? There's only one way, causally speaking, the future can go. So he takes that claim about epistemically settled to mean causally settled. And so he interprets me as saying a causally settled future cannot also be causally open, where causally open is the opposite of causally settled. So again, he takes me to be saying an a causally settled future has to be causally settled.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's kind of sounds like a tautology, but it's not what I'm saying. There are many ways that we can talk about the openness or the settledness of the future. In and these need to be kept distinct, because otherwise you're going to wind up conflating positions that are distinct positions, and you'll misunderstand the dialectic, right, within which open theism exists. So in a paper of mine I wrote several years ago called The Fivefold Openness of the Future, I distinguish like 5 different ways in which the settledness or openness of the future could be understood. I distinguished the causal sense, the alethic sense, which means having to do with truth, the epistemic sense, having to do with knowledge, the ontic sense, having to do with the ontology of time, and the providential sense, having to do with the nature of God's providential decree. And in that paper, I presented a series of arguments to the effect that if the future is causally open, then it's going to be open in all of these other senses. But you can't just conflate those distinctions and say, well, all of these other terms just are the causal sense. Because just to give an example, right? So your proponent of simple foreknowledge is going to say, yes, the future is causally open, but it's not. And a lot of these people will also affirm that the future is ontically open, and some of them will want to affirm that the future is providentially open.
But
they will say it's epistemically settled and alethically settled.
Yeah.
A typical Calvinist is going to want to say, well, no, it's causally settled, and it's providentially settled, and it's alethically settled, and epistemically settled, but they might want to say that it's ontically open. Maybe God created a world where the ontology of time is, like presentism or like a growing block view. So there, the future events don't yet exist. All of these are positions that real people hold. So if we try to boil every type of settledness down to the causal sense, then we can't, we no longer have the means to clearly articulate how these positions are, how they are different, right? How is the Molinist view, how is it different from the simple foreknowledge view, different from the Calvinist view, and so forth, right? And there are different ways in which these different views can be cashed out. Some of them might affirm, say, the future is ontically settled. Others might affirm it's ontically open. And that's where you can have a split within those different camps. Mm-hmm. So Bill here is just wrong to try to assimilate the epistemic, the idea that the future is epistemically settled to the claim that it's causally settled. He's being uncharitable toward me, and not taking what I'm saying seriously here. I'm a trained philosopher, and like at least most philosophers in the analytic tradition, I try to choose my words carefully, and I'm not going to use the term epistemic when I mean causal. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to say causal when I mean epistemic, and vice versa, right? I completely reject the tautology charge. That's ridiculous on its face.
Well, going to the 820 mark here, he says that you use this tautology then to justify a completely different claim when you said, in other words, future contingency and foreknowledge are incompatible. But you've not proven this claim. Well, in the video, we're giving a 1,000-foot view of what open theism is and demonstrating that it's not atheism. Mm-hmm. The video wasn't this was several clips, which he acknowledged at the beginning of this article that these are several clips. So it doesn't seem that he interacted with the original clip that you were and engaged with the context of that to see if you even went on to attempt to prove this claim, but somewhat held you accountable for me using your clip. Which you talk about being uncharitable. That doesn't seem to be a good way to engage with this. I mean, you can take anything out of context and then hold that person who was in the video responsible, even though they're not the ones that didn't provide that full, robust articulation.
Yeah. I mean, on the part of that video that you had clipped out, I'm just presenting, here's what I take open theism to be. These are the core claims, and one of those claims is future contingency and foreknowledge, where foreknowledge is understood as the idea that the future is epistemically settled, right? That there is a unique way the future is going to go, and God knows that exhaustively. That those are incompatible claims. Yes, I haven't proven that claim because that wasn't the point of that part of the video. I do go on in that video that you excerpted from to present what I think is a very strong argument in defense of that claim. But he says anyone can prove that future contingency and Calvinist determinism are incompatible. Well, yeah, of course, because the Calvinists, the future contingency is basically the idea that the future is causally open, whereas the determinist says it's not. So yeah, of course, those are incompatible, right? So again, he's this whole comment is sort of based on the idea that all I've got is this tautology, and he's just not taken what I say seriously. If I'm sure Bill prides himself on being a good interpreter of scripture, but if you can't interpret other people in a way that takes the terms they use, interprets it carefully and seriously, then it doesn't bode well for how one approaches other texts. So I would encourage him to be more charitable when listening to what people you may disagree with are saying. Don't try to put words in their mouth.
Or ignore the fact that it's an isolated clip from a larger context, because what we're doing, what he did in this article to your statement would be like proof texting without regard for the context and intent of the chapter or book of the Bible. So, it's a form of proof texting without regard for context.
Yeah.
But jumping down to the 9:20 mark here, he says that your discussion is followed by a statement that's then put on the screen, and this is me. So he's back to criticizing me, and you may join him. I'm okay with that. If the future has been eternally settled, both God and man are fated, neither are free. And what I meant by this was, if there was never a moment in the life of God where he determined the content of the future, then he's a fated agent that's destined to bring it about due to some driving force outside of his own free decision.
Yeah. So let me think. I think we skipped ahead.
Did I jump past this?
But that's okay. I mean, he has that thing about future contingency. I'm trying to follow on in my notes here. But...
I'm sorry. No, I jumped that because we had addressed that previously. My mistake.
Yeah.
Because this is where he's saying that most open theists are simply not knowledgeable enough about history or their own philosophy to realize their accusations are hypocritical.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the only thing I would maybe add there, he talks about future contingency is this concept drawn from Aristotelian philosophy. That's at least a plausible claim, because you can point to Aristotle as one of the earliest people to talk about the problem of future contingents. But then he says it's ironic that open theists are quick to criticize their opponents for using concepts derived from Greek philosophers when they do the exact thing. That's a cheap shot, really. Open theists don't criticize people for using concepts derived from Greek philosophy. That's not the problem. Where we criticize, say, classical theists, we believe that if you look closely at the Bible, it does not support things like absolute immutability and divine timelessness and impassibility and absolute simplicity and a lot of the distinctive claims of classical theism. And in fact, we think that the Scripture points in exactly the opposite direction, that God is in some respects mutable and passible, and that his knowledge is dynamic, and he exists in some sense, kind of he enters into reciprocal relations with creation. There's a give and take between God and creation, and it's not just a one-way arrow going from God to creatures and never vice versa. So we don't criticize our opponents for just using concepts derived from Greek philosophy. Like, the criticism is more nuanced than that. It's that you are using these concepts, like the Platonic ideal that perfection requires absolute immutability and stuff like that, to lead to a conception of God that is contrary to Scripture.
Yeah.
It's not simply the fact that there are Greek concepts that are influencing you, but that they're influencing you in a certain direction, and that direction is biblically, and I would argue also that it is philosophically problematic.
Because what we're saying here is God says X, and you're taking a philosophical construct derived from Greek philosophy to say God did not mean X.
Yeah.
And that therein is the criticism. It's not that it was derived from the Greeks. We're not saying, hey, don't eat Greek food because all things from Greek are bad. We believe in general revelation. I mean, we believe in that there is truth that's found in all sorts of places because God has made himself known.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in the application of these to the negation of what God said about himself in Scripture where the criticism comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So to then sit back and say, well, we're just criticizing them for using concepts derived from Greek philosophy. No, we're criticizing them for using these concepts to the detriment of the express statements of God about himself in the text of Scripture. That's the criticism. But he stopped short of doing that, and therein, I think, presents somewhat of a caricature and a false criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, I think that's enough on that paragraph.
So jumping over to the 920 mark, he says that your discussion is followed by a statement where I put on the screen, if the future has been eternally settled, meaning there was never a moment in the life of God temporally or logically where he dictated the contents of the future, then both God and man are fated and neither are free, because he's fated to actualize something that he never freely determined.
Yeah. So
Please don't tell me I'm wrong. I like that statement a lot, Dr. Rhoda.
Well, I think there's a couple of ways you could read that. So
Okay.
when you say it's eternally settled, you could mean that it's kind of eternal, so we're sort of from the divine decree on, and right, and if so, then you can say, well, but God's decree was free.
But that would assume, at the very least, a logical moment where he freely decreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had the clip from Ryan Mullins on there who was making that point, and I think he's exactly right. And most people who are Calvinists and even Molinists would, who have worked this stuff through, would agree with that point.
Yeah.
They would say, yes, there is a logical moment that is pre-volitional, right, where God's considering all of his options. Now, but a lot of these people want to, say, affirm some kind of divine timelessness, or at least spell their view out in a way that's consistent with divine timelessness. And so they'll want to say that this moment, this pre-volitional time moment, is merely a logical moment and not a temporal moment.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's
where Ryan's criticism of it being pretty much a useless fiction at that point would come into play, because it's not actually serving any real function at that point.
Yeah. When he makes that point, he's actually is kind of drawing in part on a paper I wrote back in, I think it was 2014 or thereabouts, where I argued was about the problem of foreknowledge and fatalism and stuff, and I argued that divine timelessness was irrelevant to this whole problem.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the claims I brought up in that paper is that if you're going to say that there's a logical sequence between things, that the terms in that sequence need to be mutually compatible, right? Like, take a paradigm example of this. You have a valid argument, right? You have your premises and your conclusion that follows from the argument, right? You could say, well, there's a logical priority of the premises to the conclusion, right? But it can only be merely a logical priority if they're all mutually compatible, right? And so we say, if the premises are true, then conclusion is true. They're all true together, right? But if you have a scenario where you've got one state that is incompatible with another state, then they can't be sort of merely in a logical sequence. And this is what we have with the divine creative decree, right? The state where God is contemplating his options. He's got all these different possibilities, and he's not yet decided, right? God is experiencing this as an open-ended decision at that moment, right? Then God makes a decision, and now, one of those possibilities has been seized upon as this is the one, right? I choose this flavor of ice cream, whatever, I want this kind of world. And at that point, the state is one of having decided, right? Mm-hmm. It's no longer open-ended. You've settled upon one option to the exclusion of the others. And that kind of transition is one where the before and after are mutually incompatible, because you cannot be both not having yet decided and having decided at the same time.
And yeah, in a simultaneous,
Right.
in a
They
simultaneous state. Yeah.
both be true together, and so the transition has to be a temporal transition. It can't be a merely logical sequence.
Mm-hmm.
And so for that reason, I don't think you can combine divine timelessness with any genuine divine freedom. If God is free, God has open options and makes a genuine choice at some point from among those options, then that choice itself is going to define a moment of time for God.
I understand eternality to mean not atemporality, but a measure of time, like from ages to age, because I take it in like the biblical context.
Yeah.
Do you think it would have helped had I instead of saying if the future has been eternally settled, both God and man are fated, would it have made a difference if I'd inserted instead of eternally, if I'd have said timelessly?
I think that would be better. It's still going to depend on this argument that I sketched, that these sort of sequence implied by a free decision cannot be a merely logical sequence or merely explanatory sequence. It has to be a temporal sequence. But if that argument is sound, then it's going to be true that if the future, or if,
because even if he's timeless, there is no future respective to God, because he's timeless. So you get into some really interesting nuance, and language seems to really break down once you leave the
yeah. One other point in that quote there, if the future, when you say like the future, you're talking about what is currently future, or what kind of from the moment of God's decision making, the pre-volitional moment, what's future from the perspective of that moment.
Yeah, I could have said if the contents of all of time has been timelessly settled in an eternal sense. I don't know. You get it in nitpicking. I think in the context in which I threw it on the screen, it should make some sense as to what I was trying to allude to. But I'm always trying to be as precise and clear as I can, and I'm learning too as we go. I don't mind admitting that.
Yeah, I think at this point that Bill is commenting on, there were some things that you displayed on the screen where you said things like or that, like, where did I put this? I may be getting ahead of myself here, but where you said things like, God is fated and stuff like this, and I think in part he's reacting against that because it is it's just not at least obviously true without further argument that Calvinism entails that God is fated, or that divine timelessness entails that God is fated. It's I mean, that may in fact be true, and I think that timelessness does have that as a consequence, that it rules out genuine divine freedom, but it's not a truism. It's not something, the truth of which just jumps off the page, so to speak. Right.
Yeah, I need to work on drawing that out a little bit more clearly and connecting the dots for the viewer, because I'm thinking about 3 steps ahead and just assuming that the viewer has been following my channel and line of thought and reasoning, and I need to be a little clearer. So I take the criticism on the chin, and will promise to try and do better, but guarantee you I probably won't.
Yeah. So
I'll try.
I think
I'll
he's
try.
right to offer some degree of pushback here and say, well, hey, the Calvinists can still affirm that God is free, and I think that's just true. He's right about that. In fact, the Calvinists don't need to affirm divine timelessness, right?
Well, if you yeah, I mean,
I don't think
if you're just looking at the basic core tenets of Calvinism, I would agree with you. They don't.
Yeah. So
it seems like most that I encounter, and that may be anecdotally, but most do. But I would say it's not necessary to that system.
yeah.
Yeah. So he says there's nothing inherent to Calvinism which denies God any sort of freedom, and I think you've made it very clear that if we take the core tenets of Calvinism in conjunction with the classical theist position of atemporality and divine simplicity, then we get into some real issues there.
Yeah, but what's causing the problems there is the atemporality and the divine simplicity and stuff, not the Calvinism per se.
Yeah, and I don't think I stated anything about Calvinism in this section.
Mm-hmm.
Although the gentleman I was responding to was a classical theist and Calvinist who was calling open theists heretics, non-Christian, and atheists. So there may have been some loss of nuance in my responding to Anthony Rogers instead of Calvinism at large or classical theism at large.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I hope that the context of all this was clear. Was there anything else you'd like to add to this 920 section?
I think I'm good there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting close to almost being done here.
Yeah.
930, the claim that an eternal decree is the same thing as having no decree at all and resolves to mere fate is ridiculous. But again, I think we've just touched on this. If it's a timeless decree where God never freely issued it, then the question is well, where did that decree come from? It completely ignores the Calvinist view that God is atemporal. Well, no, here we've already addressed this. Anthony has said that God is atemporal. And in previous videos, I've pointed out how Mr. Rogers will actually reject legitimate foreknowledge and predestination because those are tensed propositions because of his commitment to atemporality. So I've even questioned Rogers on this, and he went on to say that was just metaphorical, analogical, that there really is no legitimate foreknowledge and predestination because both fore and pre come from the prefix pra, meaning before.
Yeah.
So God can't have foreknowledge without being temporal.
The way he could try to articulate his view would be by distinguishing between temporal priority and, say, explanatory priority.
Yeah.
And saying that when I talk of God's foreknowledge, I mean knowledge that is, at least on the typical Calvinist view, that is, in some sense, explanatorily prior, not temporally prior.
Yeah.
Right. Or that the predestination that it's, in the order of explanation, God's decree comes before, but that's not.
That seems to be an abandonment of the context and intent of those terms as used in Scripture.
Yeah,
which operate and assume a temporality.
But if you want to be an atemporalist, then those are the kind of moves you got to make.
Yeah, you can squeeze and shift, and you might be able to get it in there. At the 10:05 mark, he says, similarly, the claim that Calvinists believe that there was a moment prior to the divine decree where the future was open for God also betrays an ignorance of the Calvinist view. But Dr. Rhoda, isn't there an entire controversy over this known as the Lapsarian debacle or debate? I mean, if we say that there was a moment prior to the divine decree where the future was open, as Ryan had mentioned in that video, we've kind of abandoned the logical order of moments here.
Yeah.
So I don't understand what he's trying to criticize.
Yeah. Well, the Calvinists certainly believe that there was at least a logical moment or an explanatory moment prior to the decree. So the prior, mean logically prior or explanatorily prior.
Yeah.
The question then is whether that must also be, or whether this kind of priority must be temporal. And I've presented an argument just a few minutes ago, and your video had a clip from Ryan Mullins presenting an argument to the effect that yes, this would be a temporal priority, or would have to be if this is a genuine expression of divine freedom.
And that's
So,
a view that I share.
yeah.
He says they claim that his decree was made atemporally or outside of time. There are many problems with this atemporal view, but the open theist is only revealing his own ignorance when he fails to present this view accurately. So it seems like he started off going, "You're wrong. Yeah, you're right, but I want to complain anyway."
Mm-hmm.
Am I missing some nuance here, or do you think we can go on?
Yeah, let me just add one more point here. So he says the open theist is revealing his ignorance. I
mean, Ryan cited numerous Calvinists in that. So, I mean, I don't know why he would say Calvinists don't hold to that.
Yeah, I don't think it's right to attribute ignorance here. Or to say that open theists or even scholars such as Ryan, who's not himself an open theist, he's a Molinist sympathizer,
That's right.
who are being uncharitable. Rather, what we're saying is, if we take certain things that Calvinists say, we can drive logical implications from those things. Some of those logical implications conflict with other things that Calvinists say. Right? So, does that mean we've misrepresented Calvinism? No. Does it mean we're ignorant of Calvinism? No. We're just trying to call attention to what seem to be internal the tensions within the theology.
Well, I mean, and again, I spent to varying degree roughly 30 years affirming Calvinism. I grew up in a Calvinist family. I went to various flavors. The longer I was in that system, the more of a higher form that I took, a high view of God's sovereignty. But it was when I started considering how this tenet of Calvinism conflicts with this tenet, which conflicts with this tenet, and I was real honest with that in light of the text of Scripture, that I started to say, maybe I shouldn't just be appealing to mystery here. Maybe there's an internal inconsistency and something out there has better explanatory power.
Yeah. I think a lot of views, kind of make a kind of inappropriate appeal to mystery to try to protect themselves from critique. It's certainly fair game to invoke mystery as a kind of ignorance. We just don't know how this works. Perhaps you haven't thought about it very long. Perhaps a question is posed, you don't have an answer. I don't know. But whenever you're appealing to mystery to try to respond to an apparent contradiction, I think that's just illegitimate.
Yeah.
If someone's presented what seems to be a refutation of your view, or derive what seems to be a logical contradiction from things you affirm, or then you can't get out of that by just saying, "Oh, it's just an antinomy. It's a mystery. It's a." Because if you can play that card under those kind of conditions, in the face of an apparent contradiction, then
there's
what's
no
the
end.
whole point of rational argumentation anymore? You've just why should we reason about God at all then? Let's just become complete Mysterians and not do theology and just say, it's all a mystery. We have to be able to follow the argument, at least to the extent that clear logical implications are accepted for what they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean to use a crude analogy, which that's all I know. It would be like saying it's raining and it's not raining, and someone comes in and goes, "Well, it can't be both," and you go, "It's a mystery."
Mhm.
At that point, I mean, you're not even trying to engage with reality. You're just throwing it all out. It makes truth unknowable, and yet Christ said He is the way, the truth, and the life, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But such appeals to mystery obfuscate the truth, and they keep you in bondage rather than setting you free.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to admit ignorance. It's okay to admit that we've encountered something that we no longer have an explanation for, but it's something entirely different to mask a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what led me out of Calvinism to an extent. It was that and a few other things in a Bible study. But is there anything else you'd like to tackle here? Where they?
I think I'm good on that. I think we have one more little.
Yes, sir. Right here at the 15:20 mark. William Hasker made a movie analogy, which Fortenberry says he says the movie analogy that Hasker rejected is actually a really good analogy of the known but not determined view of the future, where he said that the Lord of the Rings film was in the can, it just hadn't played yet. But he's saying that this is a great view, and it was rejected out of hand by most open theists because they're focused almost exclusively on a denial of Calvinist determinism. Hasker is a good example of this tendency. He did not offer any argument to prove the movie analogy was flawed. He simply said that it was and moved on. Well, again, I've had some wonderful guests on my program, yourself included, but I have yet to have Mr. Hasker on the program. And that clip was taken from another segment, and it was offered as a summary, as an overview of the open position, primarily in response to Anthony Rogers claiming that this is just a form of atheism. So if the critique is that in the clip that I used, he didn't go on, well, that wasn't the purpose of the video. It wasn't, a 2, 3, 4 hour in-depth philosophical and biblical. And so it seems to me that he's abusing Hasker in this segment without considering the fact that in the original context, he very well may have gone on to do that.
Yeah.
But what would you like to add to this? I'm sorry.
Just say, okay, so about this movie analogy or the film strip analogy, so he says it's a really good analogy. I don't think it is. Or let me put it this way. The analogy only works on an eternalistic ontology, which is where eternalism is the idea that past, present, and future events are all equally real. So the future is sort of there. From a God's eye perspective, all of reality is like this film strip that's just laid out, and all of it is just kind of all eternally just there all at once, right? It all exists. I don't know if Mr. Fortenberry intends to endorse an eternalist ontology, but if you don't have that kind of ontology, then I don't know how you can use this film strip analogy.
Well, and one serious problem that I see with an eternalist perspective is that Christ is suffering on the cross right now, not having achieved victory. That is a reality as clear as the reality that we're in now, that he is in heaven interceding for us. He's in the grave.
Yeah.
Because what you get into is something called what is it? It's each one of us are distinct agents in a slice, in a fraction of a film screen, a segment of time. So I am not a consistent perpetual being from birth to death, but
Yeah.
I am segmented into different temporal instances, so that the Warren that is here now is not the same Warren at all as the one when this video started. So
Yeah.
there is a Christ that's dead on the cross right now in that eternalist perspective. And sin will be eternally before God. It will never be ultimately and totally defeated and redeemed.
Yeah.
So I see as major problems with that analogy and that view.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of eternalism or any kind of block ontology. It winds up having to view like persistence over time. We, instead of existing all at once, which is called endurantism, right? All of me is right here now, right? You could say, no, I actually, me here now is just one slice of kind of a space-time worm that begins with my conception and ends however long into the future that I exist. Hopefully God doesn't annihilate me at any point. I'll try to.
Well, there's a comic book representation of this in the comic book and the movie The Watchmen. Dr. Manhattan is a Neoplatonist type of character who has persisting consciousness, and he can go to each one of those different realities where he exists simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to create so many problems, but especially when you get into the matter of sin and Christ and his redemptive work. I don't see how a Christian can hold that with any confidence and say that Jesus is risen, sin is defeated, because there's a real sense in which Jesus is dead on the cross and sin is ever before him.
Yeah. I think ontological issues aside, ultimately, open theists reject the film strip model because we think it's incompatible with the causal openness of the future. If we think of the future as causally open, say, like at some future point, you're going to have a free choice to make, some momentous choice that'll change the course of your life, right? You can go through door A or you can go through door B, and it's fully up to you which door you go through, right? At that time. Well, if the reality is causally open, then until you make that choice, there simply is no objective fact of the matter as to which choice you are going to make. The fact about which choice you make comes sort of after, in the order of explanation, the actual choice. So
and you would say that sequence is both logical and temporal. Or would you say it's an either or as far as explanatory power?
Well, I think it's got to be a temporal sequence there. It can't, be merely a logical sequence.
Okay.
But let me put it this way. So if the course of your life is now open-ended, it's contingent upon this choice that you have not yet made, then anything that is explanatorily dependent upon that is itself going to be open-ended, right? So, for example, if we say God has foreknowledge of your future choice, and God knows that you're going to choose this because you in the future choose this. Well, to the extent that the future is causally open, you can go this way or this way. Well, if you go this way, then God will have always foreknown on this view that you choose this way. If you go this way, God will have always foreknown you this way. But because the choice has not yet been made, it's open-ended. That means it's got to be open-ended as to what God has always foreknown, right? Because that knowledge is explanatorily dependent upon the actual choice. Until the choice occurs, there is no fact about what that choice is. And so anything that's explanatory dependent on that choice is itself got to be a future contingent. Well, if you try to fit this into a model of divine timelessness or into this eternalist thing, you run into a conflict, because you're saying that these future realities are eternally, timelessly there. Well, but if they're dependent upon your choices, they have to be future contingents, right? Because they're dependent upon something that is a future contingent. And so and how can something that's timeless and eternal be a future contingent? You can't have it both ways. And this is why the block theory of time, the eternalist model of time, the film strip analogy, it's incompatible with creaturely freedom. It's incompatible with future contingency, because you're trying to say that, well, because it conflicts with the try to put this as simply as possible, but anything that depends on a future contingent is a future contingent. And if God's knowledge depends on what you do, or if the contents of the eternal temporal block depend on what you do, and what you do is in some respects a future contingent, then those parts of the temporal block or those parts of God's knowledge are also future contingents. And you can't reconcile that with divine timelessness or with eternalism.
All right. In a paper Dr. Rhoda published entitled Foreknowledge and Fatalism, Why Divine Timelessness Doesn't Help, he provided the following diagram. For clarification, exhaustively definite foreknowledge, or EDF, is the idea that the future as God knows it is wholly definite and not at all open-ended. Additionally, a specifier is something that picks out a certain kind of future as the actual future. For example, God's foreknowledge on the EDF view is a future specifier. The diagram shows that if the existence of a specifier is explained by which choices are actually made, then the specifier is itself a future contingent, because there are causally possible futures in which that specifier, say a chocolate one, exists, and also causally possible futures in which it doesn't, and a vanilla one does instead. If the specifier is itself a future contingent, then it can't be a timeless or static thing. Now back to your regularly scheduled interview. Having said that, again, this Mr. Was it Fortenberry? Bill Fortenberry, this gentleman here, he does have at least one other article, part one of, I'm not sure how many, responding to John Sanders. So if you want to hear some specific critiques to, I believe it was The God Who Risks. I think that was the book that,
volume 2 of The God Who Risks.
I think, that's what he was responding to. So if anyone watching wants to click on the link, I'll put a link to this article in the video description, and you can find the other articles there on his website. But other than that, I think we've pretty much touched on his quick response to a video on open theism. It only took us about 2 hours. Is there anything parting you'd like to say before we send everybody off on their way to an indeterminate, causally open future?
I think we've probably said enough.
Okay.
But I've enjoyed the conversation with you, Warren, and it's always good to talk about these issues, and it's, you know, I can fully respect people like Mr. Fortenberry and others who take contrary views to open theism, because I've been thinking about this stuff for over 20 years now as a philosopher, and you know, I can say that the issues are that the issues are many, and they are complex, and it's not easy to tease all the issues having to do with truth and ontology and causation and knowledge and all the biblical interpretation stuff out. It's so it's to be expected that well-meaning Christians are going to land at different places in this larger debate about divine providence and foreknowledge and human freedom. And that's okay. You know, we need to try to be charitable toward each other and try to understand as best we can where we're coming from, but you know, if we don't.
And to his credit, Mr. Fortenberry did not share Anthony Rogers' sentiment that open theists are a bunch of damnable heretic, atheists. So he presented a critique to the contents of a video.
Yeah,
and he wasn't so vitriolic as Mr. Rogers. So yeah. I do appreciate that. And when this was sent to me, I said, well, this would be a perfect opportunity to respond to some of the criticisms, maybe elucidate, clarify a few things, get some correction from you as well. I appreciate that. But Dr. Rhoda, thank you so much for coming on Idol Killer and setting us all straight, myself included. It's always a pleasure visiting with you, and I appreciate your insight and your kindness. I think it comes across really well here that that brothers in Christ can disagree, and we don't want to assume just because somebody has a different view immediately that they're not part of the kingdom. We can be charitable, and iron sharpening iron. We'll get a few sparks, here and there. But as you said, these are complex issues, and as people who follow Christ, we're committed to trying to work out the truth of God revealed in Scripture, and that does require some application of philosophy. And therein, we failed and flawed human beings are going to wrestle around and disagree. But I appreciate you coming on here and visiting with us. And is there anything I could link for you? Anything I could throw up, or is there anything you'd like me to send our viewers your way if they want more information?
I don't know. You could point them to my website or my blog, where from time to time, I try to tackle issues that are relevant to open theism and what I call open futurism, which is just the general view that the future is open-ended, in some respects. But
right. Well, I'll put that information in the comments, and anybody looking for more information, Dr. Rhoda is a great resource to go and read up on and study and learn from. And I want to thank Mr. Fortenberry for his criticism here, even though we found some areas of minor, sharp, and disagreement, as well as some areas of agreement. But until next time, you guys, thank you so much for tuning in to Idol Killer. Until next time, God bless and take care.